Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jenna Flanagan. I am one of the hosts of Metro Focus, a nightly news magazine seen on PBS in the New York metropolitan area. And I'm pleased to welcome you to a 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival online event. And it is my pleasure to welcome today's author, Hanif Abdul-Rakib. Hanif is a poet, essayist, and cultural critic. He is the author of so many books, including The Crown Ain't Worth Much, a 2016 poetry collection, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, a 2017 essay collection, and Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes on a Tribe Called Quest, which was a 2019 nonfiction book. My head, I'm still thinking 2019 is last year. Anyway, of the many things that Hanif has done, he's been very vocal about sort of describing Blackness and the way it's experienced in America. And he does so in his latest book, A Little Devil in America, Notes in Praise of Black Performance. And so I'd like to welcome our author, Hanif, to our discussion. Thank you so much for joining us for the Brooklyn Book Festival.
Of course, thanks so much for having me. I'm sad I can't be there in person. I love the times I've gotten to be there in your life. So,
Oh, okay. I was
this
going to
is
say, well,
great.
we're working it out. We're working it out. This is how
Yeah.
we live now. So for this particular book, and I do have it with me here, what was it that you brought to this particular set of essays that you were crafting? Because it's a combination between sort of historical narrative about a lot of people that I certainly did, and I think a lot of readers might not have known about, but it has a larger theme to it. So what was it that you were crafting when you brought these essays together?
Well, I was thinking about honestly stories that just delighted and excited me. This is a book that, for me, the goal was kind of to find pleasure in writing it, which I did. And I did that through a sort of rigorous research process that led me to stories that I maybe knew a little bit about, but wanted to know more about, or people like the magician Ellen Armstrong, who I was fascinated by and wanted to kind of get to the bottom of her life. Um, I'm someone who knows and understands that the history that we're told is not the history that exists always, or the history that we're taught in schools, or the history that exists in some form on the internet is not the full history when it comes to Black performance, when it comes to Black people in America and beyond America. But for this book, I was like focusing on America, but of course, globally. And so getting to the heart of some of these stories was somewhat miraculous to me, and stories that are told in a certain way, but not told fully, like the story of Don Shirley's life. Like Don Shirley has a full life that exists to me in a way that's much more fascinating than what was presented in that movie. What was it called? That old bullshit, The Green Book. And so, it's important, I think, to kind of hammer away and have these stories that delight me and fascinate me about performers. I love Don Shirley's music, and I love Don Shirley's story of him studying the way music and sound impacts people. Like, that story of his life is so fascinating. And so parts of this book were just leaning into the evangelical nature of writing and saying, like, I'm excited about this story and I'm so excited about it. I want to climb to the mountaintop and shout it to the world. And that's all. I don't want to present any kind of argument for or against. I mostly just want to be an evangelist in the name of this miracle that I found, I stumbled my way onto.
Well, before we get to or at least what my takeaway was of the connecting thread with a lot of these stories, I do want Don Shirley is a name that a lot of Americans know now because of, let's just say, that movie. But one of the names that you brought up was news to me. I was completely unaware of the story of Ellen Armstrong. And so very quickly, I'm wondering if you could just sort of recap who she was and what made her story so unbelievably unique.
Yeah, it was wild. And I'm not taking credit for this, obviously, but there's so much more trickling in the world now about Ellen Armstrong. Like, she didn't have a Wikipedia page when I first dug her out. And then since the book, she's gotten a scant but present Wikipedia page and some citations there, which is great. But you know what's funny is I found out about Ellen Armstrong just off of like curiosity Google. You know, there was a point where the phrase Black girl magic started to get, early on, it started to get commodified really quickly. And a lot of Black women have written these essays, you know, warning about what would happen if that commodification continues. And I think we saw it. I mean, obviously, like we saw that play out in like the years after. But at the time, and I forget when this happened, it was maybe 2017. At the time, I was like reading these essays and like, yeah, I mean, this is real. I'm with it. But then the back of my brain was doing this thing where it was like, but I'm also interested in a very literal definition of the term Black girl magic, which means I'm interested in finding out the history of Black women magicians in America and like who was the first Black woman magician to helm her own show. And that took me to John Hartford Armstrong, her father, which led me to Ellen. You know, like I found out about John Hartford Armstrong first, and there just wasn't a lot of the historical record on Ellen Armstrong. You know, a lot of stuff, a lot of her belongings late in her life got thrown away or sold. You know, she performed primarily for Black audiences or mostly only for Black audiences. And so there wasn't as robust of a record of her magic career. But I was so fascinated by her, particularly that latter part that she performed primarily for Black folks. And I went on a real thing. I called magic historians all around the country. I like, you know, I was just cold calling, like, you know, asking people who knew magicians, if they knew magic historians, just calling anyone. And I still found out very little. I mean, I did not find out. I mean, you know, she doesn't, it's funny because she has maybe a couple pages in the book, but she's such a driving character of what made the book, because she's someone who had a life that I could not access. And my hunger to access the fullness of her life and what she gave really echoes, I think, throughout this whole book with what I was actually after.
Well, what was it that you were actually after?
This, you know, like, I look at someone like Mary Clayton or someone like Don Shirley or someone like Josephine Baker, like people, I think this happens primarily with Black women where their legacies are affixed to tragedy because that is romantic in the American experience, right? But like Whitney Houston's not a tragic figure to me. Or there's tragedy that we don't have her with us anymore, of course, but Whitney Houston's full life is not one of tragedy to me. And Mary Clayton's full life, though heartbreaking in ways, is not one of tragedy. It's a life of triumph to me. And so I was kind of after that. I was after this reformatting of relearning, even for myself, that our legacies are beyond, our legacies eclipse tragedy. And the romantics of tragedy are what they are, I think, in the American machine. But the Ellen Armstrongs and the Mary Claytons and so on and so forth, I believe they deserve to be rendered a bit more generously. And I think that some of this was relearning for myself too, you know, to have, to be conditioned a certain way to believe that someone's life is only tragic, like a Mary Clayton. For me, some of this research and some of my writing towards the pleasure that I find in the work of folks was a relearning that these lives were more than just tragic. And are more. I mean, Mary Clayton's still working. Mary Clayton released a beautiful album this year, you know? Mm-hmm. So she's still working, still joyfully, she's still joyfully working. And I'm so thankful for that.
Well, of course, the book, you are, these essays are all highlighting these stories, these narratives of different Black performers. But really sort of what I found so interesting is that all of them, even though they were performers professionally, there's an element of performance that, first of all, exists in all American life, but I think that one that is very unique for Black people living in America. And I'm wondering if that was your intent, to have that be sort of the through line between all of these different narratives.
Yeah, I think so. And also to just widen the experience and understanding of what performance is or can be. You know, I mean, because some of the pieces in the book are not necessarily about performers who performed on stage. Some of them are
Mm.
about spades, you know, like I think to play spades is a type of performance. Or, um, you know, when you get into the heart of the game of spades, it is performative. And a lot of it was for me too, to kind of remove the shame from the idea of performativity. Because I think when I think about the word performative, or I hear the word performative, I instinctually attach it to something negative or something to be ashamed of. But there's something really loving about performativity as well. There's something that's really tender about performativity, and this idea that there are moments where, at least I can't speak for everyone, I don't perform for others and I am performing for myself. You know, um, I don't really, I could take or leave my own reflection. I think I'm not really too interested in the work of the mirror. I'm actually kind of horrified, you know, I'm not horrified by the way I look, but I'm horrified by the fact that like, there are so many surfaces through which I can like see myself back at me. And I'm not always, and I'm like, well, that's not who I think I am. Um, but because of that, I think I've learned to perform myself towards a comfort with even my reflection. And that's for only me. And that's performativity too. There's a performativity in that I don't think I'm ashamed of. Um, and so that's, you know, I love Josephine Baker most. I mean, Josephine Baker won, you know, the title of the book is from a speech that Josephine Baker gave at the March on Washington. The book is dedicated to her. She's just such a big person, not just in this book, throughout my life. My first book of poems, The Epigraph, is Josephine Baker. But throughout my writing and living, I've long been arcing towards Josephine Baker. And, you know, one thing that fascinates me about her is that if you go on YouTube, there's like an archive of like 50 years of, you could watch 50 years of Josephine Baker performing. You know, stuff from the 20s all the way up to the 70s. I mean, that's not like a lot of other artists. And she was an athlete. I wish more people would talk about her like she was an athlete, you know, like some of those clips of her in her younger stage days where she's like, I forget the movie that this is from, but there's a scene where she like runs full speed and jumps off a pretty high platform and lands directly into a dance move. You know what I mean? Just like seamlessly. That's athlete. I mean, she's an athlete. She's one of the great athletes of our life. But I like her the most in her late career shows where she couldn't move as well, but she could still command an audience. You know, she like in Paris in the early 70s, she had those big feathers on her head and she wasn't as mobile, but she could still get the audience to do anything she wanted them to do. And that's the kind of quiet but powerful performativity I was trying to uplift throughout the book. Like, what is it to think about performance when it is these gentle and tender, slow moving things that still shift an ecosystem?
Well, how do you view, at least performance, and Black performance at least, both official and unofficial, its role in shaping American culture?
Oh, I mean, yeah. Well, the easiest answer I can give is that it's everywhere, and you know, everywhere you can see and touch, but nowhere, not always everywhere in terms of historical record, right? Um, and that is because I think America doesn't know at large. I think the people who have, for most of my life at least, been telling stories in America, who are in charge of storytelling, have struggled to tell stories of Black performers and their influences and impact outside of the lens of their pain. And that is how, you know, the stories of pain become more romantic than anything else. And that's a little tough. And, you know, I think that's That's kind of, but it's also everywhere, you know, like and not just among, and I don't mean this just in terms of non-Black people taking on Black performance and manipulating it for themselves. I mean, too, like with some pleasure, I have borrowed from Black performers, you know, like growing up as a kid in the Midwest, there was definitely a Black culture I grew up immersed in, but I was also watching rap videos in the 90s and uh, borrowing from the performers. I was watching Soul Train and borrowing from the people I saw. I was, you know, there's an exchange that I think happens regionally and sometimes even more in a granular way, more geographically, where borrowing style from one neighborhood over. That I think that's a kind of joyful exchange among Black folks that when we talk about Black performance, I don't only want to talk about it as what has been taken. I kind of want to talk about it in this form of exchange of, you know, I saw this person dancing like this and I'm going to practice it in my mirror now. That's really pleasurable for me.
Well, in terms of performances taken, I mean, there's so many different places I kind of want to take this now, but um, I'll start with the idea of performances taken sort of, you know, borrowed from other places, just organically from wherever in the country you are. And that, of course, makes me think of the easy story from the 90s of the fictional Carlton Banks. Of course, there was a very famous episode of The Fresh Prince where he tries to join this Black
Mhm.
fraternity and is basically informed that his performance of Blackness is all wrong. And that sort of, I guess, what you might, at least through the episode, the performance of the fraternity brothers is the way that it's done correctly. So I guess what my question to you is that, is there a broadening definition of the performance, if you will, of Blackness in America? Because for a while, for some people, for some kids, particularly those who didn't fit a very specific mold, they might have felt outside of the performance or that they weren't performing it correctly. They didn't know the steps. As you mentioned, you didn't know how to play spades.
Yeah. Um,
Which,
I,
by the way, I can't either. So no shade
I
on
mean, I can now. I
that.
certainly can now, but it's the thing where like you watch, you know, you're invited to a table, and then and I mean this about stage, and perhaps broadly everywhere. And you're invited to a table. You find the table that will invite you, and then you learn. I learned spades by watching elders, and then getting it wrong, and then being like playfully corrected. You know, like um, I learned to survive playing the dozens because I didn't want to fight. You know, you learn these things. I got good at the dozens because I wasn't as good at fighting, or at least I didn't want to fight as much. Um, I think there are as many ways, and I mentioned this in the book. Perhaps I think there's as many ways to be Black as there are Black people, and none of those ways feel wrong to me. Now, that doesn't mean that I agree with or endorse all those ways. I mean, like Ben Carson is performing a type of Blackness, and I could give. Yeah, I probably can't curse. I cursed already, but I won't curse again. I don't really care. I don't really care about his performance of Blackness, but it is nonetheless a performance of Blackness. You know what I'm saying? And so this doesn't mean I have to endorse them all or agree with them all or uplift them all. But I worry about ascribing a binary right versus wrong to them also. It doesn't feel like my place or anyone's place. And I think, that Fresh Prince episode has some flaws in it, of course, which is it came out at a different time in a different era, all that. But I remember that episode as a kid, and you know, one thing I read about in the book is that I'm really fortunate that I was so able to find my people really close to me everywhere. And part of this is because I had older siblings who came up in an era where I just think, I talk about this with music because I see Black folks on the internet who are sometimes like, well, I was listening to Weezer and then Black people made fun of me. And I can't take that experience away from them. I just don't know that because everyone I grew up around, most people had older siblings. And I grew up in an era of, I think, a really golden era of college radio, early mid 90s. And to have older siblings in college um, meant that they were bringing back all that music to the house. Um, and a lot of my homies had older siblings. And so everything I loved about music was being reflected in the people I loved and people who looked like me. The people who put me on the punk were Black. Um, and so I think my experience is just one of vastness and generosity, and I'm grateful for that.
Well, that's certainly beautiful. When you were talking about Josephine Baker earlier, one of the notes that I took that struck me was that when you, first of all, focus, of course, on the latter half of her life, you write that she crafted the version of herself that felt most true to what she wanted. And I wonder if, from your perspective, that kind of feels like what everyone is striving for.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with any luck, and to be fair, Josephine Baker had the resources to do that not everyone has, and also just, immense gifts and ability that not everyone has. But I think that's something that is, of course, well worth striving for all of us.
Of course. One of the other profiles that stuck out to me, at least, and gave me an immediate reference or connection in my mind was when you tell the story of Sun Ra, who I knew peripherally but didn't really know as a composer, etc. But of the things that you wrote about him or quoted him as saying, I guess one of them was that from him, I've run out of language to express that avalanche of anguish I feel when faced with this world. So if I can't make sense of this planet, I'm better off imagining another. And in reading that, the first thing that came to my mind that suddenly clicked was, oh my God, Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet suddenly makes so much more sense. And I'm wondering if that was the kind of connection that you were making when going back and researching to tell this story of Sun Ra.
Yeah, there was actually a section of that chapter that was all about Fear of a Black Planet that I had to take out, just because it
Oh, okay. So then I was on the right track.
yeah. It just didn't fit, and I had to kind of be honest with myself in editing and be like, I really want this in there, but I don't think it's fitting. But that was, I'm so. What I loved about Sun Ra is that he spoke so matter of factly about what he believed, or what his experience was, or he believed experience to be. And he wasn't trying to apologize or explain his way out of much. It was just like, listen, I'm not from this planet, and y'all are just going to get used to that. And it was just such a matter of fact presentation, to the point where it was like, well, of course he's not from this planet. Listen to the music. Look at this dude. He's like not from here. And there's something about that feels self-protective. To shield oneself from the horrors of one world by living in such a way that you don't believe you belong to it. I think with disbelief, I look upon America with disbelief so often, and I know so many folks who do. And there's points where I think so many people I know or myself are like, I can't believe I'm here, or I can't believe I live here. I can't believe I was born here. I can't believe I am enduring the realities of the here. And whether or not, whether or not it's healthy to believe so richly in not being of the here, I don't know. But I think Sun Ra might have been onto something by saying, like, I don't have to answer for the ills of this planet because I'm not from this planet. And to say, like, my presence here and what I'm doing here is actually a service, right? Like, Sun Ra was so intense about and intent on saying, like, I was sent here to do this, but I'm not from here, and you're just getting it while I'm here, and that's it. And there's something kind of special about that.
Well, then because that sort of then makes me think of the way that you were describing Whitney Houston earlier, when a lot of people talked about her talent and her gift, it wasn't that she wasn't of this planet, but that she was touched by God.
Mhm.
And that's a tradition that I know has existed within the Black community for years and years and years, that when someone is just so gifted or so passionate or something, it's that I've heard something like that before, that they're not of this world. They're more than like just this earthly plane, I guess. Does that jive with at least what you were sort of thinking or
Yeah, I mean, maybe, I think like the expression of an artist being touched by God feels a little different in that,
okay.
um, you know, rarely is the artist claiming that themselves, or rarely,
Mm.
um, I'm drawn now thinking about this. There's a story of Marvin Gaye making What's Going On. Um, and he was, up in the studio all hours. He was like sleeping in the studios at Motown. If Smokey Robinson would come in the mornings, and Marvin Gaye would still be there, like slouched over the piano or whatever. And Smokey Robinson would be like, Smoke would be like, what's going on? Like, why? And Marvin would say this thing like, I'm not, like, God is writing this album. Like, I'm not writing this album, it's God. And so I have to, like, I'm not in charge or in control of the making of this album. I am merely a vessel for, and that's like a distinct and explicit wording of something that I think I have witnessed play out. Like when I watched Aretha Franklin in Amazing Grace, um, there are parts of it where I feel like, yes, Aretha Franklin is here and Aretha Franklin is a performer in question, but it's almost like Aretha Franklin is a vessel for something greater, that I don't really understand. There are parts of this all through, like Aretha and Whitney and Mahalia. I mean, just like a whole lineage of singers, Nina Simone even, where it's like, well, I don't, and I also think I ascribe that to things I don't understand. Talent so immense that I actually can't wrap my head around it. Um, which happens most with some of those folks, like what Nina Simone is capable of, I have a hard time wrapping my head around, you know? Um, Watching Amazing Grace, like, I just don't understand it. Like, I love it. I'm in awe of it, but I also have moments where I'm like, this doesn't seem like it's something a person should be capable of. Like, if Aretha Franklin is a person in the way that I'm a person, granted, she's much more talented than I am, then it just doesn't feel like we're not of the same, we don't have the same kind of standard operating points. And so that, I think, is where I'm at. I always think about the miraculous, um, and how easily I could be seduced by the miraculous.
Okay, okay. Um, so then what is your take on, because frequently, and a lot of the individuals who you sort of, I don't want to say profile, but whose stories you told in the book, they got, if you will, congratulated, and I'm using very heavy air quotes here, with phrases like, you've transcended race,
Mhm.
you're more than just Blackness. I'm wondering, first of all, how do you interpret that as a compliment that I think sometimes, especially white people, can think that it is? And what is the impact of those words to you?
Well, I always felt like that was attempting to um, detach a person from their blackness and therefore make them more palatable to the wider and whiter world, or to make a people more comfortable with an artist, right? Also doesn't have much meaning to me. I don't really know how one transcends race, because it really only works, or that statement or that idea really only works to the benefit and the comfort of white people. Like, um, I'm sure there are some, but I don't know too many Black folks who are like, I want to transcend race and become, um, an almost muted version of myself for my own, like even to my own people. I don't know many modern artists who are that excited about, the prospect of that. But to say, this person transcends race, it's all kind of a part of the same machinery of detaching either Black performers or activists or radicals from their Blackness or from their radical nature, right? Be it, hand-picking quotes from revolutionaries or, stifling some quotes from revolutionaries, these type things. But it's also in this process of saying this person transcended Blackness, which is shorthand for this person is catering to my comforts, which has very little to do with the actual work, It's very little to do with any kind of brilliance. It's positioned as this compliment, but it has very little to do with the actual gifts that folks are bestowing upon people by choice too. I think about it is I'm always like, people gotta understand that all this is by choice, like the art that Anina Simone gave, she didn't have to give. These people chose to spend their time doing this within a country that did not deserve their brilliance. And so that alone, I think, is, I'm not interested in falling into arguments about transcending race because there are some decisions made by people to be who they were and create the way they wanted to create in a space that did not love them fully. And there's no transcending that.
Well, speaking of people who chose to create in a space that did not welcome them, another one of the stories that stood out to me was that of William Henry Lane, who was also known as Master Juba, I believe is how he's pronounced it.
Yeah.
And anyway, so in the book, you talk about how he was this entertainer all around, but also a dancer. Dickens himself called him the greatest dancer he's ever seen. And what I thought so interesting was that when we get to the part of the story where P.T. Barnum's minstrel show, he has a Irish clog dancer who's basically done, and he needs to replace him. He replaces him with Master Juba. And to say that the white dancer was upset, I think is putting that mildly, because he felt as though he was better doing these sort of African-inspired dance moves than the actual person of African descent.
Right.
And through all of that, well, first of all, just what was that story like, just uncovering, because it was kind of maddening, but it also felt very relevant reading that story.
Oh yeah, it's funny. Like I don't have TikTok and I don't know much about TikTok, but I had so many people like read that part of that story and be like, "This is like what's happening on TikTok." And
it's quite literally what's going on TikTok. I can attest to that.
Yeah, I had to like dig into it because I was like, people like I think the 5th time someone said that to me, I was like, well, what the hell's going on TikTok? You know what I mean? I don't know. So I did some research and it blew my mind. I was like, yo, this is what's going on TikTok. And I didn't know, I mean, I wrote that chapter and I wrote that part of that especially, and I uncovered that story, I think before. Now, granted, like to be clear, like what's going on TikTok is just like the latest iteration of something that's been going on for millennia. But like the current iteration of that, like what's happening on TikTok, that wasn't happening when I wrote that part. And so it has been wild to kind of dig into the current relevance of that and think, oh, there are white folks who are laying claim to the movements they learn from Black people and insisting upon benefiting from that theft and presenting themselves as like the inventors of dances and whatnot. And that has been wild. It's been wild to really sit with the way these things have continued to resonate. And I'm someone who's, I'm a bit of a pessimist or a cynic about history, or I understand history is something that is always evolving but never changing in a way.
Wow.
But it's fascinating to kind of have a moment where 5 people or more were like, this is TikTok. And I was like, I don't know anything about TikTok. So What you mean? This is TikTok, and then go on TikTok and be like, damn, this is TikTok.
History is always evolving, but never changing. I mean, are we capable of change?
Well, I'm not much for the collective we. I mean, I think individuals are capable of change. I mean, I have to believe that. You know, I'm someone
Yes.
who, um, with my beliefs and my like socio-political beliefs around abolition and anti-carceral thinking, like I have to believe that individuals are capable of change, and that um, yeah, and because of my literal life, like things I've lived and endured and gotten to the other side of, I'm required to believe that individuals can change. But um, do I think like America is capable of large scale change on a structural level? Probably, I mean, not in any substantial way that I think would satisfy um, or rectify the many layers of violence and equity harm that's been done through centuries. But I mean, I'm notoriously not much of an optimist, and so that is maybe not the answer that folks want to hear. But I think that's what I can bring myself to at the moment.
It's an honest answer, and that's not always what people want to hear.
Yeah.
But in my retelling or very general rehashing of that story, what struck me was that you write that there will always be an audience wanting a Black face, but not necessarily a Black person. And that's what really struck at my core. And I was wondering what were your intentions when you were writing that?
Oh, I mean, I think I'm just articulating what other people have articulated in better ways before me, almost certainly, or um, just articulating like what the evidence has shown us throughout history. Um, you know, there's type of disposability, or you know, if a Black artist is working outside of an accepted box, I think they can become more disposable in the idea of particularly entertainers and politicians, and well, not politicians, because you know, like I don't really care much about these politicians, um, but you know, and I think that commodification is the engine of so much of American culture, and if someone can be found, like, not to go back to TikTok, but there's a reason why those dancers, you know, like the dancers who, I remember the NBA All-Star Game thing, where like they brought those three young white women out to do dances that they didn't invent, and they didn't bring
Mm-hmm.
out the young Black woman who, this young Black girl invented those dances. And it was a prime example of this, where it was like, well, we want the culture, but the actual person at the forefront of the culture, we can take or leave. And that has a residual effect, right? Especially in a country that is so prone to forget things, eager to forget not only its harms, but to forget its trailblazers, depending on what those trailblazers look like. And on a cultural level, to say we're going to remove the inventor of this dance from a large platform and instead put white people in the forefront of it. That's another example of that, extracting the culture from the person who created.
So then I guess sort of going back to my earlier question, but it just, and again, it just sort of reinforces with all of these narratives is that from what I can tell, especially through this book, is that American culture cannot be separated from Black culture, and it doesn't really exist without Black culture. So I guess, is it possible for the country to come to some sort of better understanding or appreciation, at least, of the people who have created the culture? regardless of how it's been, perhaps changed or co-opted or manipulated, etc.
Maybe I'm not very hopeful for America. And so,
Okay.
and I'm not actually very invested in redeeming America. I'm not really, I don't think of America as redeemable. But what I do think instead is that I don't think I needed, when working on this book and when talking about this book and when hearing from people about the book and all this, like, we don't actually, it would be nice if the machinery of the country would acknowledge the brilliance of, and actual labor, not just brilliance of Black performers, actual labor of Black folks and Indigenous folks who literally built the country. But I'm just not, because I am not very hopeful for that, I am now, I think, invested in a different project, and it is how can collectively marginalized folks or folks interested who love, who understand and love the marginalized folks, how can we celebrate the work that is not being celebrated? Like, Ellen Armstrong is miraculous and brilliant and put her head down and did her work for her people. And that's so worthy of celebration. I don't even care if, quote unquote, America at large builds an Ellen Armstrong statue. It doesn't matter to me. What matters is that I could put a story about Ellen Armstrong in a book and say, isn't this amazing? And if someone can read it and say, this is amazing, I want to find out more. And then maybe down the road, there will be enough of an archive of her life that we who care can collectively celebrate outside of the scope of what America does or doesn't do. I'm just not, I can't, at least anymore, and I haven't for a long time, set my clock to what I imagine America is capable of, because I don't imagine it to be capable of very much. And so there is something that is very useful to me about a project like Little Devil, which is that, again, I get to kind of evangelize and just see who shows up so we can collectively and joyfully evangelize together. And we don't really need American recognition to do that. Now, if I'm talking about like historical, yeah, it would be great if history and the archives reflected brilliance in a way, but I also don't know if I don't know if I need it. I think there is usefulness in it, but I'm just not optimistic enough that we will get there. And by that, I mean history being taught that reflects the contributions to Black folks, not just in America, but globally. You know, I know this is a deeply American book, but it has to be stressed that this is a global, you know, it's a very, like, a global thing. These contributions are global, and someone could have written a book about this in any corner of the world, or a book like this one in any corner of the world. I live in America, and I am somewhat of a student of American culture. And so that's why this one came out the way it did. But this is what we're talking about here in terms of neglect of acknowledgement is a global phenomenon.
Okay. My final question, which I asked to all the authors, is what is it that you want someone, or you would hope, or is there anything that you would hope someone takes away after having sat and read your book?
Oh, I hope they read about someone they didn't know about or didn't know a lot about before, and go down some rabbit holes. Because that's how a lot of the book came to be, where a name came up, or a small story came up about a name I knew, and I just chased after that. I chased after that story. I chased after that name. And it was so exciting. There's so much in this book. There's so much that I found during the researching of this book that couldn't go in the book because it wouldn't fit, or it was too circuitous, or I wasn't yet ready to write about it. But there was such pleasure for me in just finding out more or refinding out about things I knew already. And, I know I keep going back to Ellen Armstrong, but truly there's a discovery, the discovery of someone like Ellen Armstrong, um, for me was so miraculous to know that she lived and did the work she did, and that I lived a whole life to this point not knowing about her work, and then to get to find it, it was so miraculous to me. And I didn't even feel shame or frustration about not knowing about her life, I felt some sadness, sure, but I just mostly felt um, overwhelmed with pleasure that I got to have that I got to have a moment with her work.
I think that's a great way to put it, because the story of Ellen Armstrong was definitely the one that stood out to me the most. And again, I think it was because I had absolutely no concept. Not that there were other figures in the book, but I knew, of course, there were probably going to be a lot of Black dancers or somebody like performers, composers who I wasn't aware of, but I knew they existed. I had no idea that there were Black magicians at all. And just the simple fact that her story awakened me to the fact that there was an entire genre of career or something. I just never once connected with African Americans. That blew my mind.
Oh
So
yeah,
I thank you. I thank you so much for that story, specifically for that reason.
the history of the history of Black magicians and Black practicing magicians, particularly in that era, in the late or the early 1900s, mid 1900s, is just so deep and fascinating. And yeah, there's a lot of great historians, like Black magic historians, doing a lot of great work around that, and I'm really thankful for them as well.
Of course, of course. And there are I think lots of sparks and rabbit holes to want to go down after reading this. But I do have one last question.
Yeah.
And when we were sort of talking about just, okay, so can America anything? It did make me go back to thinking about Josephine Baker and several other performers who, especially from her time period, that had to leave America to just be able to breathe. Um, you did say that this book is really a global story, and I'm wondering, I mean, I guess is that, you know, an option B? Because sometimes when I hear suggestions or something about like, well, Black people should just go X, Y, and Z, um, is it possible to outrun anti-Black racism?
Well, no. I mean, and I can only speak in a very limited way on this, because I don't live in
Yeah.
other places. I have no experience living in other places. Um, but yeah, I mean, one, anti-Blackness is global, um, and it might manifest itself differently depending on where you are in a country, in a nation, along the globe. But it's a global thing. So I don't know if folks can outrun it, but you know, I undoubtedly believe that there are places where folks might find comfort beyond America. And yeah, I
Okay.
I don't know, but for me, like I've only ever lived here. I've only ever lived in America, and I will likely only ever live in America. Um, and I don't have enough experience in other places to kind of understand what life might be like or not be like. Um, and and I also don't have, I've never had designs on leaving. I never thought about leaving.
Mhm.
Um, but I have friends who look into it regularly, and I'm always like, well, I'll visit. I will absolutely visit.
I've also heard that as well. Well, to everyone, the book is A Little Devil in America. I cannot recommend it enough. There is so much about the Black experience that gets shared, and I think a different perspective based on the stories not only that you focus on, but the fact that they're all together. You're able to uh, see the connecting thread through such unique and amazing stories. So Hanif Abdurraqib, thank you so much for writing this book and honestly bringing, especially Ellen Armstrong, A Little Black Girl Magic, into my life. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for chatting with me.
Okay, you're off air. Thank you so
Cool.
much. Great show.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was a pleasure.
Yes, that was great. The book was wow. I mean, I wanted to go see, I found one of the posters and then I was looking to be like, can I get this printed? Like seriously, it was eye-opening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was a real joy, and thanks for the Brooklyn Book Fest for having me. And yeah, hope everyone's days and weeks are easy to them.
Likewise.
All right, I'll talk soon. Bye.
All right, bye.